Hello everyone, welcome, and let's explore joints or articulations. So joints are sites where two or more bones meet. They are one component of the skeletal system, and their main function is for movement. So they are sites where the rigid elements of our skeleton meet, so they allow movement. So do we have more bones or joints in our body? So we have more joints than bones in our body. So a single bone can make several joints. So we have more joints than bones in our body. Now let's see classification of joints. So joints can be classified either by function or by structure. So first, let's see functional classification of joints. So functional, as the name indicates, this classification is based on the amount of movement. So based on the amount of movement they allow, we can divide joints into three. So we have a synovial joint. These are immovable joints. For example, sutures, the joints in our skull, they are immovable joints. So they are an example of a synovial joint. The second type is amphiarthrosis. These are slightly movable joints. For example, the joint between the two pubic bones, symphysis pubis joint, is a slightly movable joint. So it's an example of amphiarthrosis. The third type is diarthrosis joint. These are freely movable joints. And most of the joints in our body are diarthrosis joints, especially most of the joints in the upper limb and lower limb. They are freely movable joints. They are diarthrosis joints. In the other classification is structural classification. And this is based on the material binding them and based on the presence or absence of a joint cavity. So based on these two criteria, we can divide joints into three. So we have fibrous joints, we have cartilaginous joints, and we have synovial joints. So first, let's see fibrous joints. So as their name indicates, fibrous. So the bones are connected by a fibrous tissue. So such joints, they don't have a joint cavity. Only the bones are attached by a fibrous connective tissue. And there are three types of fibrous joints. We have sutures, we have syndesmosis, and we have kyphosis. So first, let's see sutures. So in sutures, they are found only in the skull. And as you see it here, the bones are attached by a very short fibrous tissue. So due to that, sutures are immovable. And gradually, after middle age, even this fibrous tissue, it will ossify, it will be replaced by bone. So sutures are immovable joints, and the bones are attached by a very short fibrous tissue. The second type of fibrous joints are syndesmosis joints. So in syndesmosis, literally syndesmosis, in Greek it means ligament. So in such joint, the bones are attached by a ligament. So for example, radius and ulna, they are attached by interosseous membrane. So interosseous membrane is the flat sheet of ligament. Similarly, tibia and fibula, they are attached by interosseous membrane, another fibrous tissue. So the joint between radius and ulna, the joint between fibula and tibia is an example of a syndesmosis joint. So as you see it here, the fibrous tissue in the syndesmosis joint, it's relatively long, so it allows slight movement. It's not freely movable, but it allows slight movement, so they are slightly movable. The last type of fibrous joint is a kyphosis joint. It's a unique joint between a tooth and its socket. So it means it's a joint between our teeth and maxillae and our teeth and mandible. So when we see the joint, it's like a peg and socket type of joint. And the two are attached by a periodontal ligament. And this periodontal ligament is a fibrous tissue. It's a short fibrous tissue. So the three types of fibrous joints are sutures, syndesmosis, and gymphosis. Now let's see the second type of joint, which is cartilaginous joint. So as the name indicates, cartilaginous. In such type of joints, the bones are united by cartilage. So like fibrous, they don't have a joint cavity and they are not highly movable. So we have two types of cartilaginous joints, and the bones are joined by cartilage and they don't have a joint cavity and they are not highly movable joints. So we have synchondrosis and symphysis joints. Normally, we have three types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. But elastic cartilage is not involved in joints. So if the bones are attached by hyaline cartilage, the joint is known as synchondrosis. If the bones are attached by a fibrocartilage, the joint is known as symphysis. But elastic cartilage, it doesn't participate in the formation of joints. So when we see synchondrosis, the bones are attached by hyaline cartilage. So when we see some examples, so the joint between epiphysis and diaphysis, it's one example of a synchondrosis joint. So between epiphysis and diaphysis, we have epiphyseal plate, and epiphyseal plate is one example of hyaline cartilage. But gradually, this plate will be replaced by bone. So the joint between epiphysis and diaphysis, it's a temporary joint. Gradually, the plate will be replaced by bone. The other example of a synchondrosis joint is the joint between first rib and sternum. So first rib is attached to the sternum by a hyaline cartilage. So it's also another example of a synchondrosis joint. So the joint between epiphysis and diaphysis and the joint between first rib and sternum, these are examples of synchondrosis joint. The other type of cartilaginous joint is symphysis. So in such type of joints, the bones are attached by fibrocartilage. So for example, the joint between vertebral bodies, the joint between the two pubic bones, they are attached by fibrocartilage. So they are symphysis joints. They are an example of symphysis joints. And these are slightly movable joints. The last type of joints, or the third type of joints, are synovial joints. So synovial joints are freely movable joints, and most of the joints in our body are synovial joints. And synovial joints, they dominate in the limbs. Most of the synovial joints are found in upper and lower limb. And synovial joints, the articulating bone ends are surrounded by a joint cavity. So they contain a joint cavity. So as you see it here, the bones are surrounded by a cavity. Now let us see features of synovial joints. So they are surrounded by a cavity. So the capsule, the joint capsule that makes the cavity, has two layers. So it has outer fibrous layer, which is known as the fibrous capsule, and it has inner synovial membrane. So when we see the outer layer, the fibrous capsule, as you see it, it's continuous with the outer covering of bones. So bones, externally, they are covered with periosteum. So fibrous capsule is continuous with periosteum. And the inner layer, synovial membrane, it's a loose connective tissue, and it produces synovial fluid. So the cavity is filled with synovial fluid, and the fluid is produced by the synovial membrane. So here, filling the cavity, we have a synovial fluid, and the fluid is produced by this membrane. The other features are in a synovial joint. the articulating bone surfaces, they are lined with cartilage. They are lined with a hyaline cartilage, which is known as articular cartilage. So the articulating bone surfaces are covered with articular cartilage. And most of the synovial joints, they are strengthened by ligaments. So ligaments are dense connective tissues, and they connect bone to bone. And they strengthen joints. And most of the synovial joints, externally, they are strengthened by ligaments. Now let's see types of synovial joints. So based on the shape of the articulating surfaces, synovial joints are classified into 6. So the first ones are plane joints. So plane, as their name indicates, the articulating bone surfaces are flat. So such joints allow only sliding or gliding movement. So they are uniaxial joints. They only allow movement in a single axis. So intercarpal joint, the joint between carpals, intertarsal joint, the joint between tarsals, they are examples of a plane joint. They only allow sliding or gliding movements. The second type is a hinge joint. So in a hinge joint, a concave end of one bone articulates with a convex end of another bone. So such joints are also uniaxial. They only allow movement in a single axis. They only allow flexion and extension. So they are uniaxial joints. So for example, elbow is a hinge joint. It only allows flexion and extension. Interphalangeal joints in our hand, interphalangeal joints in our foot, they are also hinge joints. And knee is also a hinge joint. So all these joints, they are uniaxial. They only allow flexion and extension. The third type is a condyloid joint. So in a condyloid joint, a concave end of one bone articulates with a convex end of another bone. But this time, these joints are biaxial. They allow movement in 2 axes. So they allow flexion and extension in one axis, and they allow abduction and adduction in another axis. So they are biaxial. So our wrist, the wrist joint, is one example of a condyloid joint. The metacarpophalangeal joint, or the knuckles, they are also an example of a condyloid joint. So they are biaxial. They allow flexion and extension, abduction and adduction movements. The fourth type is a saddle joint. So the articulating bone surfaces are like a saddle. So both of the articulating bone surfaces contain concave and convex parts. And saddle joints are also biaxial. They allow movement in 2 axes. They allow flexion and extension, and they also allow abduction and adduction. So for example, the trapezio-metacarpal joint at the base of the thumb, which means the joint between trapezium and the first metacarpal. This joint is a saddle joint. And the joint between clavicle and sternum, the sternoclavicular joint, these are examples of a saddle joint. So like condyloid, saddle joints are also biaxial joints. The fifth type of synovial joint is a ball and socket type of joint. So in a ball and socket, the rounded end of one bone articulates with a cup-like depression of another bone. So they are like a socket and ball. So such joints are multi-axial joints, which means they allow movement in every axis. So they allow flexion and extension in one axis. They allow abduction and adduction. And they also allow rotation movements. So they are multi-axial joints. So there are 2 ball and socket joints in our body. And these are a shoulder and hip joint. So they allow flexion and extension, abduction and adduction, and they also allow rotation, internal and external rotation. And they also allow circumduction. So circumduction, it's a circular movement that involves flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. So ball and socket joints are highly movable joints. The last type of joints are pivot joints. So in a pivot joint, so the end of one bone, it will be surrounded by a ligament from another bone. So pivot joints only allow rotation. So they are uniaxial joints. They only allow rotation. So when we see some examples, the joint between atlas and axis, the joint between the first and second cervical vertebrae, it's a pivot joint. The joint between radius and ulna proximally, or the proximal radio-ulnar joint, is also another pivot joint. So pivot joints, they only allow rotation. So these are the 6 types of synovial joints. So structurally, we have 3 types of joints. We have fibrous, the bones are attached by fibrous tissue. Cartilaginous, the bones are attached by cartilage. And we have synovial, the bones are attached by a joint cavity. So that's all about the classification of joints. See you in the next video.